So lower motor neuron damage creates flaccidity. And when you damage the lower motor neuron of a cranial nerve or a spinal nerve, the affected structure is going to be on the same side of the body as the neuron that you've damaged. So for instance, looking at the gingerbread man, if you damage a right spinal nerve going to the arm, then the right arm is going to be flaccid, and that flaccidity is going to be ipsilateral, meaning on the same side of the body as the lesion. Coming back up to the cranial nerves, if we damage the left facial, what side of the body is going to be impacted? What side of the body is going to be impacted? The left. What part of the body? The left side of the face. Why does damage to the left facial create ipsilateral flaccidity on the left side of the face? Because it's the left side of the face that the left facial nerve innervates. So a lower motor neuron damage is going to create flaccidity, and it's going to create flaccidity that is going to be ipsilateral, meaning on the same side of the body as the lesion.
Yeah, okay. Try and blink both of your eyes.
Here's blinking. Okay, I'm trying to close both eyes. Okay, here's laughing. Okay.
Just regular talking.
Just regular talking is really kind of difficult. It's all just on the one side of my mouth.
Try to blink your left eye.
That's about as good as I can get.
Try and lift your eyebrow.
All right, so what are we looking at here? You can see that the right side of his face, his right eye, is blinking. There's a crease right here on the right side of his face, and the right side of his mouth is moving. But the left eye is not blinking. The left eyebrow, he's not able to raise it. The left side of the mouth is not moving much. So looking at this guy, I can say entire left side of the face is weak and flaccid. Therefore, there's a problem here along the left facial nerve. Okay, now let's go through the anatomy of the vagus nerve. The vagus is a large nerve, much larger than you even see here. We're only going to address the parts of the vagus nerve that are important to us as speech therapists. So the vagus is a large nerve. It has its cranial nerve nuclei in the medulla, and the primary branch of the vagus exits the medulla and courses down into the soft tissue of the neck. You have a right and a left vagus. And the first important branch is known as the pharyngeal plexus. And the pharyngeal plexus is important because it innervates the velum and some of the muscles of the pharynx. The pharyngeal plexus innervates the superior and middle pharyngeal constrictors, which are largely, we're talking about the walls of the pharynx, and it innervates the velum. So I'm going to sort of draw a little uvula and soft palate up here. So you can see that the right pharyngeal plexus is going to innervate the right side of the velum, and the left pharyngeal plexus is going to innervate the left side of the velum. The right pharyngeal plexus is going to innervate the right muscles of the pharynx, and the left pharyngeal plexus is going to innervate the left muscles of the pharynx. And we're talking about motor movement here. So moving the velum moving the soft palate, so raising and lowering the soft palate for nasal versus non-nasal phonemes, in addition to the function, then in addition to sealing off the nasal cavity while you swallow. So those signals are being sent along the vagus, out the pharyngeal plexus of the vagus to the muscles of the velum and also the pharynx. Moving a little bit further inferior, we get to the next big branch of the vagus, or the next important branch of the vagus, that is known as the superior laryngeal nerve, or it's known in short simply as the SLN. The superior laryngeal nerve, or the SLN, innervates the cricothyroid muscle, and you can see here that you have an internal and an external branch of the SLN. So this would be the external branch, and these would be the internal branches. So it's the external branch of the SLN, or the external laryngeal nerve, however you want to say it, that innervates the cricothyroid muscle. So thinking back to anatomy, the cricothyroid muscle is that muscle that is between the cricoid and the thyroid. And when it contracts, it pulls the thyroid cartilage forward. And if you're pulling the thyroid cartilage forward, you're tensing the vocal folds. So the cricothyroid muscle is responsible for changes in your pitch, changes in the pitch of your voice. The intrinsic branch of the SLN is responsible for afferent information from the vocal folds. So when you aspirate, when something goes down the wrong way and it hits your vocal folds, you're able to feel that because of that sensation, that sensory information is being transmitted from the sensory receptors on your vocal folds to the intrinsic branch of the SLN to be transmitted back up to the brainstem and then up to the parietal cortex for processing. Continuing inferiorly through the neck, the vagus will get down into the thorax, where the right side of the vagus is going to loop under the subclavian, and then it is going to turn around and recur back into the neck. And on the left side, the left vagus is going to loop down around the aorta and then turn and recur, meaning come back into the neck. It is going to redirect itself back towards the base of the larynx. So this is known as the recurrent laryngeal nerve. It is that portion of the vagus that comes back up and it innervates all the other intrinsic muscles of the larynx other than the cricothyroid. So these are the thyroarytenoid muscles, which are the muscles that essentially are the vocal folds. And these are all the other add and abductors of the vocal folds and tensors and relaxers of the vocal folds. So your recurrent laryngeal nerve is responsible for the ability of the vocal folds to move. So now let's say let's take this and apply it to flaccid dysarthria. Let's say you have a lesion along the right pharyngeal plexus. Well, when that happens, the right side of the velum is going to be weak. So when you go to raise the velum to seal it off for your non-nasal phonemes, you're not going to have a good seal. So there's probably going to be some hypernasality there. And the right side of the pharynx isn't going to be working very well, and that's not going to help you for swallowing. That's going to negatively impact your swallowing, but that wouldn't be a speech disorder. That would be a swallowing problem. That would be dysphagia. But the hypernasality that would be produced by the velum not working very well due to the right side flaccidity caused by the right pharyngeal plexus lesion would be a flaccid dysarthria. Now, if you have bilateral lesions to both the right and left pharyngeal plexus, then your velum is going to be not moving at all, not going to be able to rise and approximate the posterior pharyngeal wall for normal resonance. So your speech is going to be very hypernasal. If you had a lesion along the, we'll say the right SLN, then what are you taking out that's important for speech? You're taking out the right cricothyroid muscle. So you're reducing the ability, your ability to tense the vocal folds, which means that you're reducing your ability to change pitch. You're going to be more of a you're going to have more of a monotone voice due to the flaccidity induced at the right cricothyroid due to lesion at the right superior laryngeal nerve. Now, if we have bilateral damage, taking out both SLNs, right and left, then both sides of the cricothyroid muscle are going to be flaccid, meaning that with one damaged, you're probably still going to have some ability to tense the vocal folds. But if both sides of the cricothyroid are not working, then your voice is going to be extremely monotone. And that monotone, that is the result of bilateral flaccidity to the cricothyroids, right and left, which is the result of lesion to the SLNs, right and left, would be considered a flaccid dysarthria. All right, so let's move down to the recurrent laryngeal nerve, sometimes known as the RLN. So once again, this is our right side, this is our left side. If you damage the right RLN, you're cutting the wire that's running between the central nervous system and the right vocal fold. So what is the right vocal fold going to be able to do? You have reduced its movement. If you've cut this entirely, then the right vocal fold is going to be paralyzed due to the lack of signals it's getting telling it to move, and the lack of signals telling it to maintain a normal muscle tone. So it's just going to be flaccid and hanging out there at midline. So someone with a lesion to the right RLN is going to be very hypophonic because of the flaccidity of that right vocal fold, the paralysis of the right vocal fold. If you knock out both RLNs, then both vocal folds are going to be paralyzed. Usually they're paralyzed. Usually when they're paralyzed, they're going to be abducted enough for the individual to be breathing past them. But sometimes they can rest too medially during paralysis, and you might get a inhalatory stridor because the vocal folds are just close enough to get a little bit of Bernoulli in there when you inhale or exhale. In a worst case scenario, they can be completely at midline and paralyzed, in which case the person can't breathe past them for very long and they have to have an emergency tracheostomy. So that's how lesion to different parts of the vagus can negatively affect speech. Now let's imagine that you have a stroke here at the medulla, at the brainstem, which is what people do, which is what happens, and it knocks out the right cranial nerve nuclei of the right vagus. You have disconnected this whole system, the whole right vagus system, from the upper motor neuron that are sending the motor plans to it. So if this happens, you're going to have the right side of the velum is going to be weakened, so you're going to be a little bit hypernasal probably. Right side of the pharynx isn't going to be working very well, so you're definitely going to have some swallowing issues. The right vocal fold isn't going to be working very well, so you're going to be hypophonic and the right cricothyroid isn't going to be working very well, so you're going to be a little bit monotone as well. Now you can imagine the devastation if both right and left vagus was taken out. Then you lose all movement of the velum. So there is no sealing off of the nasal cavity for nasal versus non-nasal phonemes or during swallowing. There is no squeezing of the pharynx during a swallow. There is no tensing of the vocal folds for prosody, for pitch changes. There is no add or abduction of the vocal folds for the production of voice, but perhaps more importantly, there's no adduction of the vocal folds to squeeze together to protect the airway during the swallowing as well. So someone that has damage to both the right and left vagus is going to be hypernasal, aphonic, so very little voice. If they have any voice, it's going to be aprosodic. There's not going to be any prosody. And due to the velum not working, there's going to be some dysphagia. Due to the pharynx not working, there's going to be more dysphagia. And due to the adductors of the vocal folds not working, there's going to be potential aspiration and penetration, which is a whole other level of dysphagia. So the nerves, the cranial nerves that we've talked about important to flaccid dysarthria tend to be the facial, the trigeminal, the vagus, and the hypoglossal. But the phrenic nerve innervates the diaphragm. And if the diaphragm or any other muscles of respiration are flaccid and cause you to have inappropriate breath support for speech, that could be considered a flaccid dysarthria, because there is flaccidity negatively affecting your speech. So there's lots of different possible profiles of flaccid dysarthria. If I were to say generally what does flaccid dysarthria look like, the most common characteristics of flaccid dysarthria tend to be some hypernasality, some imprecise articulation. So hypernasality meaning flaccidity of the velum. There tends to be some imprecise articulation, which is usually caused by flaccidity, flaccid weakness of the lips and the tongue, breathy voice because of the flaccidity, the weakness of the vocal folds, monopitch, monoloud, which tends to be due to the flaccidity of those intrinsic muscles of the larynx responsible for tensing and relaxing the vocal folds, and those muscles of adduction responsible for a lot of medial compression during phonation, which would be the interarytenoids, transverse and oblique.
Rainbow Passage.
When the sunlight strikes every drop in the air, they act like a plume. And from rainbow, the rainbow is the reason of wet light and the beautiful colors. They take the shape of a long-wound arch. When it's passable, and they still end the beyond the horizon.
Okay, last one. This one I want you to do as fast as you can. Okay? Cut, 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 cut.
What did you say?
Cut, 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 cut. Okay, alright, that one's a little harder. Alright, I'm gonna have you do the tut 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 as fast as you can again. Okay.
All right, and those two examples, in the first one, you're able to hear a good bit of hypernasality. so much so that it was sort of undermining his articulation. It's hard to understand much of what was going on. But this individual, on the ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta, you were able to hear the imprecision of the articulation. Here's another example of a flaccidus-arthria.
I wish to know all about my grandfather. Well, he is nearly 96 years old, yet he still thinks as quickly as ever. He dresses himself in an old black frock coat. There's several buttons missing. A long beard clings to his chin, giving those who observe him a pronounced feeling of the utmost respect.
So what you heard there was hypernasality. You heard some imprecise articulation. What you didn't hear was a weak and breathy voice.